Some people only hear a song once in their life, then spend decades trying to remember who sang it. Rain slammed against the towering glass windows of the Ashford Grand Hotel, while Manhattan disappeared beneath sheets of winter storm and blurred yellow taxi lights far below. The city looked drowned tonight. Cold, restless. Endless rivers of headlights crawled through flooded streets while thunder rolled between skyscrapers like distant drums beneath the dark December sky. Inside the hotel lobby, warmth wrapped itself around exhausted travelers stranded by canceled flights and delayed trains. Wet coats dripped across marble floors. Suitcases lined the walls beside glowing Christmas decorations and dying poinsettias. Somewhere near the piano lounge, soft jazz floated quietly through the storm, while waiters carried silver trays between anxious guests trying to escape the weather outside. Emily Parker moved carefully through the crowded lobby, balancing 4 cups of coffee against one arm, while helping an elderly couple find extra blankets near the fireplace. Her black waitress uniform was slightly wrinkled from a double shift that started before sunrise, but she still smiled gently every time someone looked overwhelmed. Which tonight was almost everyone. "Excuse me, miss," a tired mother whispered near the concierge desk while holding a crying little boy wrapped in a blue winter coat. "Do you know if the kitchen still has soup?" Emily immediately nodded. "I will bring some over." The woman looked relieved enough to cry. Emily offered a small, reassuring smile before continuing across the lobby through crowds of frustrated businessmen and exhausted tourists trapped by the storm. Outside, wind rattled the hotel entrance doors violently, while snow mixed with rain beneath the glowing Manhattan skyline. Near the private elevator entrance, 3 security guards suddenly straightened their posture at once. Several hotel employees exchanged quick, nervous glances. Then the lobby atmosphere shifted completely. Nathaniel Brooks had arrived. The billionaire stepped through the revolving glass doors wearing a dark charcoal overcoat dusted with sleet, while 2 assistants hurried beside him carrying phones and briefcases. Tall, controlled, emotionally distant in the polished way magazines always described powerful men. The storm followed him inside briefly before the heavy doors closed again behind him. "The board meeting has already been delayed twice," one assistant said anxiously while they crossed the lobby. Nathaniel barely slowed his pace. "Then delay it again. Sir, investors flew in from London, and now they are trapped in New York like everyone else." His voice remained calm, but sharp enough to silence everyone nearby immediately. Several guests discreetly turned to stare, while hotel staff hurried to accommodate him. Emily noticed him only briefly while placing hot soup in front of the exhausted mother near the fireplace. To her, wealthy men rarely looked different from stressed, ordinary people, just better dressed. Near the concierge desk, the hotel manager practically sprinted toward Nathaniel with forced enthusiasm. "Mr. Brooks, welcome back to the Ashford Grand. We prepared the presidential suite immediately after your call." Nathaniel removed wet leather gloves slowly while scanning the overcrowded lobby with visible irritation. "Why are there so many people downstairs?" "Flight cancellations, sir. Move them somewhere quieter." Emily overheard the sentence while carrying another tray toward the piano lounge. Her expression never changed, but one older bellman beside her quietly muttered beneath his breath, "Storm hits everybody the same." Emily almost smiled faintly. Near the fireplace, a little girl suddenly began crying harder after dropping her stuffed rabbit onto the wet marble floor. Emily immediately knelt beside her despite balancing coffee cups dangerously against one arm. "Hey." Her voice softened gently. "I think your rabbit just wanted to see New York." The little girl sniffled through tears. "Really?" Emily nodded seriously. "Very brave rabbit." Nathaniel paused unconsciously while passing nearby. He watched Emily wipe rainwater from the stuffed toy using a clean napkin before handing it back carefully like something precious. The child smiled instantly. Her mother mouthed a grateful thank you toward Emily while the waitress stood again and continued working without expecting attention from anyone. Nathaniel looked away first. "Elevator," he said coldly toward his assistant. But before they reached the private elevators, every light inside the massive hotel suddenly flickered once. Then twice. A nervous murmur spread instantly across the lobby. Outside, thunder cracked violently somewhere above Manhattan. The chandeliers dimmed briefly before emergency generators hummed softly beneath the building. Several guests panicked immediately near the front desk. Phones came out. Voices rose. A baby started crying near the elevators. One businessman cursed loudly about losing internet access during a financial transfer. Emily quickly placed her tray onto a nearby table and moved toward the frightened guests with steady calm. "Everyone is okay," she said gently. Backup power already started. Her voice was not loud. Somehow people listened anyway. Nathaniel noticed that immediately. The entire lobby felt chaotic except around her. Like calm moved wherever she moved. A frightened older woman grabbed Emily's wrist near the staircase. "Will the storm get worse?" Emily looked toward the rain-covered windows where wind howled against the glass. Then back toward the woman. "Probably." Her smile remained soft. "But people survive storms better together." Nathaniel turned slightly at those words. Strange sentence. Too sincere for Manhattan. Near the piano lounge, one exhausted musician quietly resumed playing slow jazz melodies to calm the room, while hotel employees distributed candles and bottled water across the crowded lobby. Emily returned to serving coffee between stranded guests while snow and freezing rain continued hammering the city outside. Hours passed slowly. Midnight approached. The storm only worsened. Nathaniel eventually settled into a leather chair near the fireplace while arguing quietly through wireless headphones about collapsing stock values and canceled meetings across Europe. His expression remained hard beneath the golden lobby lights. Controlled. Untouchable. Yet somewhere behind the conversation, another sound slowly drifted through the room. Very soft at first, almost hidden beneath the rain. A melody. Someone humming quietly while pouring coffee near the piano lounge. Nathaniel froze instantly. His voice stopped mid-sentence. Across the lobby, Emily stood beside the coffee station absent-mindedly, humming an old lullaby beneath her breath while refilling cups for exhausted strangers wrapped in blankets. Soft, gentle, almost impossible to hear beneath the storm. But Nathaniel heard every note. Because somewhere deep inside memories he buried years ago, a woman once sang that exact lullaby beside a small bedroom window during another winter storm long before money changed everything. The melody lasted only a few seconds before disappearing beneath the sound of rain hammering against the hotel windows. But Nathaniel Brooks felt his entire body go still, as if the storm itself had suddenly reached inside his chest and pulled open something he buried years ago. Across the crowded lobby, Emily Parker continued pouring coffee into paper cups without realizing anyone had noticed the quiet lullaby drifting absent-mindedly from her lips. Guests remained distracted by delayed flights and dying phone batteries, while the pianist near the lounge resumed another slow jazz standard beneath the dim emergency lighting. Yet Nathaniel heard nothing except those few familiar notes echoing through memories he had spent decades trying to outrun. "Sir?" one assistant asked carefully beside him. Nathaniel blinked once as though waking from another lifetime. "What?" "London is waiting on the conference line." He removed the wireless earpiece slowly without looking away from Emily across the lobby. "Tell them the meeting is postponed." The assistant looked horrified. Again, Nathaniel stood from the leather chair near the fireplace while rain streaked violently across the towering windows behind him. Again, he crossed the lobby slowly through crowds of stranded guests wrapped in blankets and frustration. Near the coffee station, Emily handed hot chocolate to a tired little boy sitting beside his grandmother near the piano lounge. "Careful," she whispered gently. "It is hotter than it looks." The boy smiled sleepily while clutching the cup with both hands. Emily turned toward the coffee machine again and nearly jumped when she found Nathaniel Brooks standing directly beside the counter watching her. Up close, he looked even more intimidating beneath the golden lobby lights. Tall, composed, expensive in the effortless way only extremely wealthy people seem to become over time. Emily reached automatically for another cup. "Coffee." Nathaniel stared at her for several seconds before answering. "Where did you learn that song?" Emily blinked softly. "What song?" "The one you were humming." She looked briefly confused before realizing. "Oh." Her expression relaxed slightly. "Just an old lullaby." Nathaniel lowered his voice carefully. "Who taught it to you?" Emily shrugged while pouring fresh coffee into a paper cup. "My mother used to sing it during storms." Thunder rolled deeply outside while emergency lights flickered once above the crowded lobby ceiling. Nathaniel's jaw tightened almost invisibly. What is your mother's name? Emily finally looked at him more carefully now. The question felt strangely personal coming from a billionaire she had never spoken to before tonight. Helen Parker, she answered cautiously. Nathaniel repeated the name silently inside his head as though testing whether memory recognized it. Somehow it did not, but the song did. Every note. Do you remember where she learned it? Emily handed coffee toward another exhausted guest before replying. No idea. She smiled faintly. I always thought she invented it. Nathaniel stared toward the rain-covered windows while another piece of memory drifted quietly back into focus. A small white house somewhere outside Boston. Winter rain tapping softly against bedroom glass. A woman humming while adjusting blankets around a frightened little boy during a thunderstorm long before magazines started printing the Brooks family name beside billion-dollar headlines. Nathaniel suddenly realized his hands had clenched slightly against the counter. Emily noticed immediately. You okay? He looked toward her again. Calm brown eyes. Exhaustion hidden carefully beneath kindness. Completely unaware, she had just reopened something inside a stranger that money never managed to repair. Sing it again, he said quietly. Emily blinked. What? The lullaby. She laughed softly under her breath. That is probably the strangest request I have gotten during a snowstorm. Nathaniel almost smiled for the first time all evening. Almost. Please. Around them, the hotel lobby continued buzzing with storm anxiety while snow and freezing rain swallowed Manhattan outside. Emily hesitated awkwardly beneath the warm lights. I do not really sing in front of people. You already did. She looked down briefly at the coffee machine while another tired guest approached asking for tea. Emily prepared the drink first before finally speaking again. It is just an old song. Nathaniel's voice lowered almost to a whisper. Not to me. Something about the honesty in that sentence made Emily pause. For one strange moment, the billionaire standing beside her no longer looked powerful. He looked lost. Quietly lost in ways expensive suits and controlled expressions usually hide from the world. Emily glanced toward the storm outside. Then softly, almost too softly to hear above the rain, she hummed the lullaby again while organizing coffee cups beside the counter. The melody moved gently through the crowded hotel lobby like warmth. Simple, slow, familiar in ways that hurt. Nathaniel closed his eyes for one brief second. Memory returned instantly this time. A woman's voice beside a fireplace. The smell of cinnamon tea. Small hands clutching a blanket during thunder. And another detail suddenly surfaced too. The woman singing had once worked for his family. Not wealthy, not famous, just kind. Sir, his assistant interrupted nervously while approaching again. The board members are asking whether you plan to address the investors tonight. Nathaniel opened his eyes slowly while Emily finished the last note beneath her breath. No, the assistant looked stunned. But the merger can survive one storm. His eyes remained fixed on Emily. Some things cannot. The assistant walked away confused while Nathaniel continued standing beside the coffee station as though afraid memory might disappear if he moved too quickly. Emily shifted awkwardly beneath the attention. Look, I really need to work. Nathaniel nodded slowly. Right. But instead of leaving, he asked one final question quietly enough only she could hear it. Does your mother still sing? Emily's expression changed slightly then. Smaller somehow. Sadness moving softly behind calm eyes. Not much anymore. Nathaniel noticed the exhaustion beneath her face more clearly now. The careful way she carried herself like someone running on too little sleep for too many weeks. Is she sick? Emily hesitated before answering. Cancer. The word landed heavily between them beneath the golden hotel lights while storm winds rattled the windows outside. Nathaniel looked toward her silently for several seconds. Then toward the crowded lobby where frightened travelers wrapped themselves in blankets while Emily continued moving from guest to guest offering coffee and reassurance despite carrying private pain nobody else noticed. Suddenly the room felt very different to him now. Not because of the storm. Because the woman humming an old lullaby beside the coffee station somehow possessed more quiet strength than everyone in expensive suits combined. Near the fireplace, the little boy with the hot chocolate began falling asleep against his grandmother's shoulder while the pianist softly played Christmas melodies through the storm. Emily noticed immediately and walked over carrying an extra blanket without being asked. Nathaniel watched her tuck it gently around the sleeping child before quietly returning to work again. No performance. No audience. Just kindness moving naturally through exhaustion. And somewhere deep beneath years of ambition and polished emotional distance, Nathaniel Brooks felt something unfamiliar begin breaking open inside him. Because for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer listening to power. He was listening to humanity. By 2 o'clock in the morning, the storm had swallowed Manhattan completely. Snow and freezing rain slammed against the towering glass walls of the Ashford Grand Hotel, while emergency broadcasts flickered silently across televisions mounted above the lobby bar. Every airport in the city had closed. Bridges were partially frozen. Traffic barely moved below the skyscrapers now. Inside the hotel, stranded guests settled into exhausted silence beneath dim golden lighting and scattered Christmas decorations that suddenly looked less elegant and more comforting. Blankets covered couches near the fireplace. Children slept against parents wrapped in winter coats. Even the wealthy executives who usually barked into phones all night had finally lowered their voices beneath the sound of wind shaking the building. Emily Parker stood behind the coffee station, rubbing warmth back into her fingers beside the industrial machine, humming softly against the storm outside. Her feet ached badly now. She had been working nearly 16 hours straight between double shifts and emergency hotel overflow. Yet she still moved through the crowded lobby with patient calm every time somebody needed help. Nearby, one older guest struggled quietly with an oxygen tank while trying to reach the elevators. Emily immediately stepped around the counter. "Let me help you." The man looked embarrassed. "You are already busy." Emily smiled gently while steadying the tank beside him. "Breathing feels more important than coffee tonight." Nathaniel Brooks watched the interaction from across the lobby near the piano lounge. He had not returned to his suite after hearing the lullaby earlier. Somehow the idea of sitting alone upstairs inside expensive silence suddenly felt unbearable. Instead, he remained downstairs pretending to review financial reports while secretly watching the waitress, who seemed to hold the entire storm together one exhausted conversation at a time. His assistant, Claire Mercer, approached carefully beside him carrying a tablet and untouched espresso. "Sir, investors from Singapore are requesting another update." Nathaniel barely looked away from Emily. "Tomorrow." Claire lowered her voice. "You have said tomorrow 6 times." Nathaniel finally turned toward her. "Then tell them 7. Claire stared at him in confusion. This was not the man who usually measured life in 15-minute schedules and billion-dollar precision. She followed his gaze toward the waitress helping stranded guests near the fireplace. "This is about the song?" Nathaniel looked down briefly at the untouched espresso in his hands. "You ever hear something that feels older than memory?" Claire hesitated awkwardly. "Not really." "I have." His voice lowered softly beneath the distant piano music. "Tonight, near the lobby entrance, hotel staff struggled to calm a frustrated businessman yelling about canceled transportation and unavailable drivers." Emily moved quietly toward the situation, carrying fresh coffee and warm towels. "Sir." The man continued complaining loudly. "I paid for premium service." Emily nodded patiently. "I understand." "No, you do not." His face reddened with exhaustion and anger. "My company could lose millions because of this storm." Emily handed him a towel anyway. "Probably." The businessman paused slightly. Her honesty interrupted his anger more effectively than apologies would have. Emily continued softly. "But nobody can negotiate with weather." Several nearby guests laughed quietly beneath their blankets. Even the businessman's shoulders relaxed a little. Nathaniel noticed that too. Emily never fought chaos directly. She softened it, like somehow people borrowed calmness from her without realizing it. Thunder cracked violently outside again, while lights flickered overhead for several terrifying seconds. Somewhere deeper inside the hotel, alarms briefly sounded before emergency systems stabilized again. Nervous voices rose instantly across the lobby. A baby began crying near the elevators. The pianist stopped playing. Emily immediately moved toward the frightened mother carrying the child. "Hey." Her voice remained low and warm despite exhaustion. "The lights are okay." The mother looked close to panic. "What if the generators fail?" Emily adjusted the blanket gently around the baby. "Then we light candles." "And if the storm gets worse?" Emily glanced toward the dark windows where snow blurred the city into almost nothing. Then back toward the frightened woman. "Then we get through worse weather together." Nathaniel stared at her quietly beneath the fading chandelier light. He remembered another woman speaking exactly that way years ago. Come first, fear later. Near the piano lounge, one of the elderly guests suddenly collapsed lightly back into his chair while clutching his chest in discomfort. Several people gasped immediately. Emily reacted before anyone else. Call downstairs medical. Her voice remained calm, but firm now. She knelt beside the man while hotel staff scrambled nervously nearby. Sir, can you hear me? The older man nodded weakly. Emily took his shaking hand gently. Good. She looked toward another employee. Bring water. Nathaniel stood instantly and crossed the lobby without thinking. What happened? Emily barely looked up while checking the man's breathing carefully. Panic attack, probably. Her calmness spread through the surrounding crowd almost immediately. He needs space and slower breathing. Nathaniel crouched beside them unexpectedly. What can I do? Emily finally looked directly at him. Something softened briefly in her exhausted eyes. Talk to him. Nathaniel blinked. What? Distract him from the panic. She kept one steady hand against the old man's shoulder. Fear gets louder when people feel alone. Nathaniel hesitated awkwardly before speaking toward the frightened guest. You from New York? The old man nodded weakly. Queens. Terrible place to drive. The man laughed faintly despite himself. Emily almost smiled. Good. Keep talking. For several minutes, Nathaniel remained beside the stranger, speaking quietly about baseball traffic and winter storms, while Emily monitored his breathing with patient calm. Slowly, the man relaxed enough for hotel medical staff to arrive and take over. Once they wheeled him carefully toward the elevators, the surrounding crowd finally exhaled collectively. Nathaniel stood slowly beside Emily near the piano lounge while snow continued hammering the windows outside. You knew exactly what to do, he said softly. Emily rubbed tired eyes briefly. My mother has panic attacks during treatments. The sentence landed quietly between them. Nathaniel looked toward her more carefully now. You take care of her alone? Emily shrugged lightly. Mostly, and still work this much. Another small shrug. Bills do not really care about weather. Nearby, the pianist finally resumed soft Christmas melodies beneath the dim lobby lighting while exhausted guests settled again beneath blankets and flickering candles. Emily reached automatically for another tray of coffee cups. Nathaniel stopped her gently with one sentence. When do you rest? Emily looked genuinely confused by the question. Then she laughed softly beneath tired eyes. Not bitter, just honest. People like me usually rest after emergencies end. Nathaniel watched her disappear back into the crowded lobby carrying coffee through the storm, while children slept beside fireplaces and strangers leaned on each other beneath flickering lights. And for the first time in years, the billionaire who controlled entire industries suddenly felt powerless against something much smaller than money. The quiet ache of realizing he had spent most of his life admiring strength without ever understanding what real strength looked like. Near 4 o'clock in the morning, the storm finally reached its worst point. Wind screamed against the towering windows of the Ashford Grand Hotel, while heavy snow buried Manhattan beneath white silence and frozen streets no taxi could cross anymore. Emergency alerts flashed continuously across lobby televisions warning residents to remain indoors until sunrise. Inside the hotel, exhausted guests slept wherever they could find warmth. Some curled beneath blankets near the fireplace. Others leaned against suitcases beside darkened hallways while children rested in their parents' laps beneath flickering emergency lights. The elegant luxury hotel no longer looked wealthy tonight. It looked human. Emily Parker moved quietly through the sleeping lobby carrying fresh towels and bottled water on a silver cart, while soft piano music drifted through the darkness from the nearly empty lounge. Every few minutes, she stopped to help someone. Adjusting blankets around an elderly woman. Finding medicine for a frightened traveler. Carrying extra pillows upstairs for stranded families sharing suites because flights had been canceled indefinitely. Her body felt heavy now. Every step slower than before. Yet she kept moving anyway. Near the fireplace, Nathaniel Brooks remained awake inside a leather chair watching the storm through towering glass windows, while untouched financial reports rested forgotten beside him. He had not opened his laptop in hours. Instead, his attention followed Emily silently every time she crossed the lobby. Claire Mercer approached again carrying a fresh phone charger and another espresso. Sir, Your board members are asking whether the merger announcement should be postponed publicly. Nathaniel barely glanced toward her. Postpone it. Claire hesitated. This acquisition took 11 months. Nathaniel looked toward Emily helping a little girl tie one loose bootlace near the staircase. Then it can survive another day. Claire followed his gaze quietly now. You have not stopped watching her since midnight. Nathaniel said nothing, because he could not explain what unsettled him most. The lullaby, the kindness, or the terrifying realization that a woman working 3 jobs during a blizzard somehow seemed emotionally richer than everyone inside his financial empire combined. Across the lobby, Emily finally paused near the coffee station and rubbed one trembling hand briefly against her forehead. The exhaustion was catching her now. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Without thinking, he stood and crossed the room toward her. You should sit down. Emily looked mildly surprised. People still need coffee. People will survive 5 minutes. She almost smiled faintly while reaching automatically for another stack of cups. You sound strangely reasonable tonight. Nathaniel leaned lightly against the counter beside her while snow pressed violently against the windows behind them. That concerns me too. Emily laughed softly beneath tired eyes. The sound lingered warmly between them for a moment before another loud crack of thunder rolled through the building. Instantly the lights flickered again. Then everything went black. Complete darkness swallowed the lobby. Several guests gasped awake immediately. Somewhere near the elevators, a child began crying. Wind howled outside while emergency systems failed to restart this time. The Ashford Grand Hotel suddenly stood silent except for the storm itself. Nervous voices rose instantly across the lobby. What happened? Why are the generators off? Can somebody fix the lights? Emily moved before panic could spread further. Everyone stay calm. Her voice carried clearly through the darkness despite its softness. Nathaniel pulled out his phone flashlight immediately while several hotel employees scrambled toward maintenance corridors. Emily climbed carefully onto the small platform near the piano lounge where guests could hear her more easily. The backup system probably overloaded from the storm, she said calmly. Hotel engineers are already working on it. Another frightened voice echoed through the darkness. What if the power does not come back? Emily looked toward the terrified faces illuminated by scattered phone screens and candlelight. Then softly she answered, Then we make the dark less lonely. Nathaniel felt the sentence settle deeply somewhere inside him. Nearby, hotel staff distributed candles while guests slowly relaxed enough to breathe again. Snow continued hammering the windows outside, but the panic began fading beneath Emily's calm voice moving gently through the darkness. Then something unexpected happened. Near the fireplace, the frightened little boy from earlier whispered shakily toward his mother. Can somebody sing something? Silence followed briefly. The pianist sat quietly beside the dark piano, unable to play without electricity. Several exhausted guests looked toward one another uncertainly, while storm winds rattled the building. Emily hesitated near the platform. Nathaniel watched her carefully beneath candlelight and shadows. Then softly, almost shyly, she began humming the old lullaby again. The melody drifted gently across the darkened hotel lobby while snowstorms swallowed Manhattan outside. Simple notes. Warm. Familiar somehow, even to strangers hearing it for the first time. The crying child near the elevators stopped almost immediately. Several exhausted guests closed their eyes quietly beneath blankets while the melody moved through the darkness like warmth. Nathaniel stood completely still. Memory crashed into him harder this time. Not flashes anymore. Full moments returning clearly now. A tiny bedroom. Thunder outside, old windows. A woman sitting beside him after nightmares while humming the exact same melody and brushing nervous hair away from his forehead. He remembered another detail now too. Her hands always smelled faintly like coffee and cinnamon. Emily's voice softened further while the lullaby continued floating through candlelight and storm shadows. Guests slowly relaxed around her one by one. Fear dissolved into quiet listening. Even the wind outside somehow sounded farther away now. Nathaniel stared toward her beneath the flickering glow of emergency candles, while realization moved painfully through him. This was not coincidence anymore. The song, the feeling, the memory. Somewhere connected to Emily Parker existed a forgotten part of his childhood he had not touched in decades. Near the staircase, one elderly guest quietly wiped tears from her eyes while listening to the lullaby. Another traveler covered his sleeping daughter more carefully beneath a blanket. The entire hotel felt softer now, gentler, as though one exhausted waitress standing in darkness had somehow reminded strangers how to comfort each other again. When the melody finally ended, silence filled the lobby for several long seconds before soft applause slowly rose through the candlelight. Emily looked embarrassed immediately and stepped down from the platform. It was just a song, she whispered quietly. But Nathaniel knew better. Because standing inside that powerless hotel while snow buried Manhattan outside, he realized some voices do not simply sing. Some voices carry people safely through storms they thought would break them. The hotel remained without power as dawn slowly approached behind layers of snow and freezing rain that buried Manhattan beneath pale winter darkness. Candles flickered across the Ashford Grand lobby like tiny islands of warmth while exhausted travelers drifted between sleep and quiet conversation beneath blankets gathered from every floor in the building. Somewhere near the staircase, a child laughed softly for the first time in hours while hotel staff passed around fresh pastries from the emergency kitchen supply. The storm still raged outside, but inside the lobby something had changed during the long, powerless night. Strangers had stopped acting like strangers. Emily Parker stood near the coffee station pouring hot tea from silver kettles heated manually over portable burners brought downstairs by the kitchen staff. Loose strands of brown hair framed her tired face now, while exhaustion settled heavily beneath her eyes. Yet she still smiled every time someone thanked her. Nathaniel Brooks watched quietly from across the room beside the dark piano lounge, while candlelight moved gently across his expression. The melody from earlier still echoed inside his head with painful clarity. He had barely slept. Every memory the song awakened kept returning stronger now. A small house near the ocean outside Boston. Winter storms. Cinnamon tea. A woman's gentle voice singing beside his bed after nightmares when he was very young and his parents were too busy building wealth to notice fear. Nathaniel looked toward Emily again while she helped an elderly guest open medication bottles beneath candlelight. Her movements carried the same calm patience he remembered from childhood. The similarity unsettled him more every hour. Claire Mercer approached carefully beside him wrapped in a borrowed wool blanket over her business suit. "The roads might reopen by noon," she said quietly. Nathaniel barely nodded. "Good." Claire studied him silently for a moment before speaking again. "You really believe she is connected to your past somehow?" Nathaniel stared toward the storm outside the giant windows. "I know what I heard. Maybe it is coincidence." He shook his head slowly. "No." His voice lowered almost to himself now. "Some memories are too specific to be accidents." Near the fireplace, Emily suddenly checked her phone and her expression changed instantly. The calmness faded from her face for the first time all night. She stepped quickly away from the guests and answered the call near one of the dark hallway entrances. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "What happened?" Silence followed while she listened. Then softly she closed her eyes. "I understand." She thanked the caller quietly before lowering the phone with trembling fingers. Nathaniel crossed the lobby without thinking. "Emily." She blinked quickly as though surprised he noticed her distress at all. "Sorry." She forced a small smile that did not reach her eyes. "I need a minute." "Is your mother okay?" Emily looked toward the snowy windows while holding the phone tightly against her chest. "Her nurse says she had a difficult night." The sentence came out carefully controlled. Too controlled. Nathaniel recognized that kind of restraint immediately. The kind people use when fear has lasted too long already. "You should go to her." Emily laughed softly beneath exhaustion. "Every road is closed. I can arrange transportation." She shook H. The presidential suite on the 42nd floor felt strangely quiet after the chaos downstairs. Snow still drifted heavily beyond the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan, while pale winter morning light slowly pushed through storm clouds above the city skyline. Inside the suite, soft jazz played quietly from hidden speakers, and the smell of fresh coffee filled the room beside untouched luxury breakfast trays arranged near the fireplace. Emily Parker stood awkwardly near the entrance holding her hotel apron folded carefully against one arm, as though she still expected someone to call her back downstairs any second. Nathaniel Brooks removed his overcoat slowly and motioned toward the couch beside the windows. "Sit." Emily hesitated. "I am not really dressed for billionaire furniture." Nathaniel glanced toward the leather sofa. The furniture survived worse things during the merger negotiations. Emily laughed softly despite exhaustion and finally sat carefully near the edge of the couch. Her body immediately relaxed more than she intended once warmth settled around her fully for the first time all night. Nathaniel poured fresh coffee into porcelain cups while snowfall softened the city beyond the glass walls. For several moments, neither spoke. The silence felt strangely comfortable now, like the storm downstairs had quietly erased unnecessary performance between them. Emily wrapped cold hands around the warm coffee cup and closed her eyes briefly. This might be the best coffee I have ever smelled. Nathaniel handed her cream and sugar automatically before realizing the familiarity of the gesture unsettled him again. Somewhere deep inside memory, he remembered another woman preparing coffee exactly the same way during winter storms long ago. Emily noticed his expression shift slightly. What? Nathaniel sat across from her near the fireplace while snow reflected softly across the suite windows. I keep feeling like I knew that song before I even understood words. Emily looked down into the coffee cup between her hands. Funny thing about songs. Her voice remained soft. Sometimes they remember people before people remember themselves. Nathaniel stared at her quietly after that sentence. The woman spoke like someone who had survived pain without becoming bitter from it. That alone felt rare. Near the window, Claire Mercer quietly entered the suite carrying folders before immediately stopping once she noticed Emily sitting beside the fireplace. Sorry. Claire lowered her voice awkwardly. I did not realize, Nathaniel interrupted calmly. What is it? Claire handed him a file. Your father's assistant called. Nathaniel stiffened slightly at the mention of his father. About what? Your father heard about the storm delay. Claire hesitated briefly. He wants the merger finalized remotely before markets reopen. Nathaniel looked toward the snowy skyline outside. Tell him later. Claire blinked in surprise. Sir, he specifically said this deal cannot wait. Nathaniel's expression hardened slightly now, though not toward Emily. Everything waits during storms. Claire quietly left the suite after that. Emily watched the interaction carefully over the rim of her coffee cup. Your father sounds intense. Nathaniel almost smiled without humor. That is a polite description. Silence settled again while snow drifted endlessly beyond the windows. Finally, Emily spoke softly. You really do not have to keep being nice to me because of the lullaby. Nathaniel looked toward her immediately. What makes you think that is why? Emily shrugged lightly. People with your kind of money usually do not suddenly notice waitresses unless something unusual happens. The honesty in her voice carried no resentment, just experience. Nathaniel leaned back slowly beside the fireplace. Maybe the unusual thing is realizing how many people I stopped noticing years ago. Emily looked toward him carefully now. The billionaire sitting across from her no longer seemed emotionally untouchable. The storm had cracked something open during the night. Beneath the expensive control lived exhaustion too. Different from hers, but real. You know, Emily said quietly. My mother always says rich people are usually just tired people wearing nicer coats. Nathaniel laughed unexpectedly. Real laughter this time. Your mother sounds dangerous. Emily smiled faintly. Only when people underestimate her. Nathaniel's expression softened at the sentence. I think I underestimated someone too. Near the fireplace, flames flickered softly against the elegant suite walls while distant sirens echoed far below across snowy Manhattan streets. Emily slowly pulled her phone from her pocket again and checked for hospital updates. Her expression tightened slightly. Nathaniel noticed immediately. Any news? Roads are still mostly closed. She tried to sound calm. But her nurse says she finally fell asleep. Nathaniel nodded quietly. Good. Emily stared toward the snowfall outside. She hates storms. Why? Emily hesitated briefly before answering. Because my father left during one. Nathaniel looked toward her carefully now. Emily continued staring out the window while speaking softly enough the words almost disappeared into the jazz music. I was 7. She smiled faintly without humor. Ever since then, storms make her feel like bad things are coming. Nathaniel said nothing for several seconds. Then quietly he admitted, my mother died during winter. Emily looked back toward him immediately. I am sorry. He nodded once while staring into the fireplace flames. After that, my father became obsessed with building things nobody could take away from him again. Emily lowered her eyes softly. Money feels safer than grief. Nathaniel looked toward her with visible surprise. Yes. The room fell silent once more beneath the sound of snow against the windows. Two strangers from completely different worlds sitting quietly while winter storms softened Manhattan outside. Then Nathaniel finally asked the question that had followed him all night. Emily. She looked up slowly. Would your mother remember where she learned the lullaby? Emily blinked thoughtfully. Maybe. Nathaniel's heartbeat shifted painfully beneath his calm expression. Could I meet her sometime? Emily studied him carefully for several seconds. Not suspicious exactly. Just curious why a billionaire suddenly cared about an old song carried through storms by exhausted women nobody important usually noticed. Finally, she answered softly. If she feels strong enough. Nathaniel nodded slowly while something deep inside him tightened with strange anticipation and fear. Because somewhere beyond the storm and the city and the years separating memory from truth, he could already feel an old forgotten door beginning to open. By late afternoon, the storm finally loosened its grip on Manhattan. Snow still covered rooftops and frozen sidewalks in thick white silence. But traffic slowly returned beneath pale winter sunlight reflecting softly against skyscraper windows across the city. Inside the Ashford Grand Hotel, exhausted guests prepared to leave while hotel employees cleaned blankets, coffee cups, and the scattered evidence of one very long night together. The elegant lobby looked almost unreal now in daylight. Like the storm had briefly transformed strangers into something gentler before morning returned everyone to ordinary life again. Emily Parker stood near the concierge desk finishing paperwork for emergency room assignments while her body begged for sleep she had not received in nearly 24 hours. Her black uniform remained slightly wrinkled and loose strands of hair still framed her tired face. Yet somehow she carried herself with the same quiet steadiness as before. Nathaniel Brooks watched her from near the elevators while speaking quietly into his phone. Push every meeting until tomorrow. He listened briefly before answering again. No, I do not care what the investors think. Claire Mercer stood beside him reviewing updated transportation schedules on a tablet. Road access to St. Vincent Medical Center just reopened. She informed him softly after ending another call. Nathaniel looked toward Emily instantly. Good. A few minutes later, Emily finally gathered her coat from behind the concierge desk and prepared to leave when Nathaniel approached carrying 2 coffees in insulated paper cups. You are heading to the hospital? Emily nodded. As fast as New York traffic allows. Nathaniel handed her one of the coffees. I have a driver waiting downstairs. Emily immediately shook her head. You really do not need to keep rescuing me. Nathaniel's expression softened slightly. Maybe I am trying to stop rescuing only myself. The sentence caught her unexpectedly silent. Snow drifted gently outside the hotel entrance while exhausted travelers loaded suitcases into taxis beneath pale, silver daylight. Emily studied Nathaniel carefully for a moment before quietly accepting the coffee. Thank you. The black SUV moved slowly through Manhattan streets buried beneath fresh snow while Christmas lights glowed softly in restaurant windows and bundled pedestrians hurried carefully along icy sidewalks. Inside the warm silence of the car, Emily leaned her head briefly against the window while watching the city pass beside them. Nathaniel sat across from her quietly holding another untouched coffee cup between his hands. Neither seemed eager to break the calm silence too quickly. Finally, Emily spoke softly while staring out toward the snowy streets. You still have not explained why the lullaby matters so much. Nathaniel looked down briefly before answering. When I was a child, there was a woman who worked for my family during difficult years before my father became successful. Snow reflected faintly across the car windows while his voice lowered into memory. She used to sing that exact melody during storms. Emily listened quietly. What happened to her? Nathaniel stared toward the passing skyline outside. My father expanded the company. We moved. Everything changed quickly. He smiled faintly without warmth. Rich people are very good at leaving old lives behind. Emily looked toward him gently now. But you remembered the song. Nathaniel nodded once. Because some things refuse to disappear even when people pretend they already have. Silence returned softly between them while the SUV turned toward the Upper East Side beneath pale winter sunlight. At St. Vincent Medical Center, Nurses moved quietly through warm hospital corridors decorated with paper snowflakes and small Christmas wreaths taped beside patient room doors. Emily stepped quickly from the elevator the moment she reached the oncology floor. Nathaniel followed several steps behind, carrying her coat after she accidentally left it inside the car. Through the partially open hospital room door, Emily immediately saw her mother sitting awake beside the window wrapped in blankets, while weak afternoon sunlight spilled gently across silver hair and tired eyes. Relief flooded Emily's face instantly. "Mom." Helen Parker smiled softly the moment she saw her daughter. "There she is." Emily crossed the room quickly and hugged her carefully beside the hospital bed while snow drifted quietly beyond the window behind them. Nathaniel stopped near the doorway, suddenly uncertain whether he belonged inside this deeply personal moment at all. Then Helen looked up. Her expression froze instantly the moment she saw him standing there. Complete stillness filled the room. Emily slowly turned back toward Nathaniel in confusion. "Mom." Helen stared at him beneath pale afternoon light, with visible disbelief moving across her tired face. Her trembling hand tightened slightly around the blanket. "Nathaniel." His heartbeat stopped cold inside his chest. The voice, the recognition. Helen Parker looked older now, fragile from illness and years he never witnessed. But suddenly he saw traces of another woman beneath time and exhaustion. Softer brown hair, once darker. The same calm eyes. The same gentle voice that once carried lullabies through winter storms decades ago. Nathaniel stepped forward slowly. "You know me?" Helen's eyes filled instantly with emotion she could barely contain. "Oh my God." Emily looked between them, completely stunned. "Mom, what is happening?" Helen stared at Nathaniel as though memory itself had suddenly walked back into her hospital room. "You were the little boy who hated thunderstorms." Nathaniel felt the world narrow painfully around those words. Memory crashed fully into place at once now. Small hands gripping blankets during storms. Warm cinnamon tea beside a fireplace. A woman singing softly while sitting beside his bed after nightmares because his parents were always working late. Helen smiled weakly through gathering tears. "You used to ask me to leave the hallway light on every night." Nathaniel could barely speak. "You were the one singing." Helen nodded gently. "Every storm." Emily sat frozen beside the hospital bed, trying to understand the impossible connection unfolding quietly in front of her. Nathaniel looked toward Helen with emotion finally breaking through years of polished control. "My father told me you moved away after we left Boston." Helen lowered her eyes softly. "Your father offered me money to relocate after the company expanded." She smiled faintly. But life had other plans. Nathaniel stared at her silently while the snow continued falling outside St. Vincent Medical Center. Because standing inside that quiet hospital room, he realized the woman who once comforted him through childhood storms had spent decades forgotten by the very family she helped hold together. And somehow her daughter had unknowingly guided him through another storm all over again. The hospital room remained completely still after Helen Parker spoke Nathaniel's name. Afternoon sunlight reflected softly across the snow outside the tall St. Vincent windows, while distant intercom announcements echoed quietly through the oncology floor. Emily sat beside her mother, frozen in disbelief, trying to understand how the billionaire she met during a winter storm somehow belonged to memories hidden inside her mother's past. Nathaniel stood near the foot of the hospital bed, unable to look away from Helen. The years separating childhood from now suddenly felt fragile. Thin, as though one lullaby had quietly connected two completely different lives all along. Helen smiled weakly while adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "You used to cry every time thunder shook the windows." Nathaniel laughed softly under his breath, embarrassed and emotional at once. "I remember that now." His voice lowered gently. "You always brought cinnamon tea afterward." Helen nodded faintly. "And marshmallows." Emily looked between them carefully. "Wait." She leaned forward slightly beside the bed. "You actually worked for his family?" Helen's expression softened beneath the afternoon light. "Years ago." Nathaniel slowly pulled a chair closer beside the hospital bed, as though afraid standing too far away might make the moment disappear. "You took care of me after my mother died." Helen lowered her eyes quietly. "Your father was building the company nonstop after that." He was grieving in his own way. Nathaniel stared toward the snow drifting beyond the hospital windows. I barely remember those years clearly. Helen smiled gently. Children remember comfort differently than adults. Silence settled softly through the room while winter sunlight reflected against the polished hospital floor. Emily watched Nathaniel carefully now. The billionaire looked nothing like the controlled businessman from the hotel anymore. He looked younger somehow, less protected, like memory had quietly removed years of emotional armor overnight. Nathaniel finally looked back toward Helen. Why did you leave? Helen hesitated briefly before answering. Your father offered me relocation money when the company moved operations to New York. Her tired fingers smoothed the edge of the blanket absent-mindedly. But my husband had already become sick by then. Emily lowered her eyes softly. She had heard parts of this story growing up, but never fully. Helen continued quietly. We stayed in Boston for his treatments. After he passed, I moved here with Emily. Nathaniel listened silently, while guilt settled heavily beneath his calm expression. My father never mentioned any of this. Helen gave a faint, understanding smile. Powerful people sometimes move so quickly through life that they do not notice who disappears behind them. The sentence landed painfully inside Nathaniel because he knew it was true. Not cruel, just true. Emily looked toward her mother carefully. Why did you never tell me the lullaby came from another family? Helen turned slowly toward her daughter. Because after enough years, memories stop feeling like they belong to anybody. Nathaniel stared quietly at Helen beneath the soft afternoon light, while another buried memory slowly surfaced. You used to leave the hallway light on every storm night. Helen smiled immediately. You were afraid darkness sounded louder during thunder. Nathaniel laughed again softly, though emotion roughened the sound this time. That sounds dramatic. You were 8. Emily watched the conversation silently, while warmth spread carefully through the room despite the exhaustion and illness surrounding them. For the first time in years, her mother looked lighter somehow. Like remembering kindness from long ago briefly eased the heaviness cancer had placed across her shoulders. A nurse entered quietly carrying medication and paused slightly after noticing the unusual emotion inside the room. Everything okay in here? Helen smiled faintly. Better than yesterday. After the nurse left again, Nathaniel leaned forward slightly beside the bed. I spent years trying to remember where I heard that song. Helen looked toward him kindly. Your mother loved music before she became sick. Nathaniel's eyes softened instantly at the mention of his mother. Helen continued gently. After she passed, you stopped sleeping during storms. Snow drifted quietly outside while hospital machines hummed softly nearby. So I sang until you finally relaxed enough to close your eyes. Nathaniel looked down briefly at his hands. I forgot most of that. Helen's voice lowered almost to a whisper. The heart remembers what the mind buries. Emily watched Nathaniel carefully after those words. His expensive composure had completely disappeared now. Beneath the polished businessman sat a lonely little boy who once waited for lullabies during thunderstorms because grief arrived too early in his life. And somehow her mother had carried that forgotten part of him safely through decades without either of them realizing it. Near the window, pale winter sunlight slowly brightened the snowy skyline beyond Manhattan rooftops. Nathaniel finally looked toward Emily again. You sang exactly like her. Emily smiled softly. I probably heard it 1,000 times growing up. Helen laughed faintly beneath the blankets. You both hated storms the same way too. Nathaniel glanced toward Emily with quiet surprise. Emily shrugged gently. Thunder makes hospitals feel sadder somehow. Their eyes met for one brief moment, filled with something calmer than attraction and deeper than coincidence. Recognition maybe, not of romance. Of loneliness understood without needing explanation. Helen noticed immediately and smiled quietly to herself. Funny thing about kindness, she whispered softly while looking toward the falling snow outside. It always finds its way back eventually. Nathaniel sat silently beside the hospital bed while those words settled deeply inside him. For years he believed success meant building a life untouchable by pain. Yet sitting inside that small hospital room beside an aging woman who once comforted him through childhood storms, he suddenly understood something far more important. The people who shape us most are rarely the loudest names in our story. Sometimes they are simply the gentle voices that stayed beside us when life first became frightening. And sometimes the smallest acts of care echo quietly across entire lifetimes before finally returning home. 3 weeks later, Manhattan glittered beneath Christmas lights and fresh snow, while soft music drifted through the grand ballroom of the Brooks Foundation Winter Gala high above the city skyline. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm golden light across polished marble floors, while wealthy donors, journalists, and business executives gathered beneath towering silver decorations and enormous evergreen trees wrapped in white ribbon. Waiters moved quietly through the crowded ballroom carrying champagne and desserts, while photographers captured every important smile near the entrance stage. But tonight the atmosphere felt different somehow. Softer, less performative. Nathaniel Brooks stood near the ballroom windows overlooking snowy New York City while adjusting the cuff of his dark suit beneath the glow of chandelier light. He looked composed as always, powerful, controlled. Yet the people closest to him noticed something had changed quietly since the storm weeks earlier. The sharpness around him had softened. He listened more now, spoke slower. Even the employees inside his company whispered carefully about how the billionaire suddenly started learning people's names instead of only remembering numbers. Near the ballroom entrance, Emily Parker stepped inside wearing a simple dark blue dress beneath a cream winter coat, while snowflakes melted softly against her hair from outside. She paused briefly beneath the lights, clearly uncomfortable inside a world built for people wealthier than herself. Nathaniel noticed her immediately from across the ballroom and crossed toward her without hesitation. "You came." Emily smiled softly. "You invited me 6 times. Nathaniel almost laughed. "I was worried you would say no 7 times. Emily glanced around the enormous ballroom, filled with wealthy strangers and expensive decorations. "I still might." Nathaniel looked toward her gently beneath the warm lights. "Do not leave yet." Emily studied him quietly for a moment before nodding once. Across the ballroom, Helen Parker sat comfortably near the stage wrapped in an elegant silver shawl, while speaking softly with one of the foundation nurses Nathaniel personally arranged to assist her tonight. Her treatment had not magically improved. Cancer still moved slowly through her fragile body. But tonight her eyes looked brighter than they had in years. Not because of the luxury around her, because somebody finally remembered she mattered. Nathaniel guided Emily toward the center of the ballroom, where guests slowly gathered near the stage for the evening presentation. Journalists adjusted cameras, while wealthy donors quieted their conversations beneath the chandelier light. Nathaniel stepped onto the stage calmly, holding several folded pages in one hand. The ballroom settled into complete silence almost immediately. Emily remained near the back of the room beside her mother, uncertain why nervousness suddenly tightened inside her chest. Nathaniel looked across the crowd quietly before speaking. "Most people believe success comes from intelligence, discipline, or ambition." His voice carried evenly through the elegant ballroom. "For years, I believed that too." Guests listened carefully while soft snowfall drifted outside the towering windows behind him. Nathaniel continued calmly. "Then during a winter storm several weeks ago, I remembered something important I lost a long time ago." Emily lowered her eyes slightly. Nathaniel glanced toward her briefly before continuing. "When I was a frightened child grieving my mother, someone stayed beside me during storms while the adults around me focused on surviving life in bigger ways." The ballroom remained completely silent now. She sang lullabies, made cinnamon tea, left hallway lights on so darkness felt less frightening. Nathaniel's voice softened almost invisibly. "And then one day my family became successful enough to forget how much we once needed kindness from people nobody important ever noticed." Several guests shifted quietly beneath the weight of the words. Nathaniel looked toward Helen Parker near the front row. "Tonight, I want to thank someone publicly who deserved gratitude decades ago, but never received it." Helen immediately looked emotional beneath the ballroom lights. Nathaniel stepped down from the stage slowly and crossed toward her through the silent crowd. Then, without hesitation, one of the most powerful businessmen in New York knelt gently beside her chair while cameras flashed quietly around the ballroom. "Thank you," he said softly enough that only nearby guests fully heard the emotion inside his voice. Helen covered her mouth briefly as tears filled her tired eyes. The ballroom remained completely still. Nathaniel looked back toward the crowd. "This woman helped raise me during the hardest years of my childhood." He glanced toward Emily standing silently beside the stage now. "And her daughter reminded me during a storm that dignity does not come from power. Emily felt tears rise unexpectedly behind her eyes while Nathaniel continued speaking. It comes from how gently we carry other people through difficult nights. Silence filled the ballroom again. Not uncomfortable silence. Reverent silence. The kind created when truth enters a room more loudly than applause ever could. Nathaniel finally stood again beside Helen and reached carefully into his jacket pocket. He removed a small silver music box worn slightly with age. My mother owned this before she died. Emily looked surprised. Nathaniel handed the music box gently toward Helen. You used to play it during storms while singing. Helen's hands trembled softly while accepting it. Slowly she opened the lid. The same lullaby drifted quietly through the ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers and falling snow outside the windows. Several guests lowered their eyes emotionally while the delicate melody filled the room. Nathaniel looked toward Emily one final time across the crowd. Some people save lives loudly. His voice softened beneath the music. Others do it so quietly the world almost forgets they were there at all. Emily stood motionless beneath the warm ballroom lights while the lullaby echoed gently around them. In that moment, wealth no longer looked impressive. Power no longer looked untouchable. Because the strongest thing inside the room was not money or status or influence. It was simple human kindness surviving long enough to return home after many years lost in the storm. And somewhere beyond the chandeliers and snow-covered skyline outside, the city continued rushing endlessly through winter night without realizing two forgotten lives had just quietly changed each other forever.